My hands are different now. I've been staring at them for the last 20 minutes. Under the kitchen light, sitting at the table where I eat breakfast every morning, looking at my own hands. The skin is the same. The scars are the same, the one across my left thumb from a mower blade in 2019, the faded burn on my right knuckle from a radiator hose. Same hands. But the soil won't come off. I've washed them 11 times. Soap, then dish soap, then the orange pumice hand cleaner from the garage. I used a nail brush until the bristles splayed. The soil is not on my hands. It's in them. Under the first layer of skin, like a stain that went inward instead of sitting on the surface. I dug up a woman's grave 9 hours ago, and something that was in the ground is now in me, and I don't think it's going to leave. I need to tell this clearly. From the start. Because I don't think I'm going to tell it again. My name is Paul Lance. I'm 44 years old. I live alone in a rented house about a mile from Cedar Bluff Memorial Gardens, which is a mid-sized cemetery on the eastern edge of Harlow, Connecticut. Population 12,000. I've been the sole groundskeeper at Cedar Bluff for just over 3 years, after a stretch of doing landscaping for the town's parks department. The cemetery job came open, I applied, I got it. There was no one to hand me anything, no retiring predecessor with wisdom to share. The previous groundskeeper had left for a better-paying job in Hartford, and the transition was a binder of mowing schedules and a ring of keys left in the maintenance shed. I want to be clear about that. No one told me anything. No one warned me. What happened started with the ground itself, and I am, as far as I know, the first person it happened to. Cedar Bluff has about 2,200 graves, spanning back to 1903. The oldest section is on the hill, small headstones, mossy, some illegible. The newer sections spread east and south along a gentle slope, with the newest plots along the southern boundary where the cemetery meets a strip of state forest. My job is maintenance, mowing, edging, leaf removal, snow clearing in winter, and what the cemetery board calls grounds integrity, which means making sure headstones are stable, pathways are clear, drainage is functional, and nothing is sinking or eroding. That last part is more involved than people think. Graves settle. The ground above a casket compresses over time as the wood or metal degrades and the void collapses. You get shallow depressions in the turf, sometimes a few inches, sometimes more. It's normal. Every spring, I go through the cemetery with a probe rod and a wheelbarrow of topsoil and fill the depressions, level them, reseed if necessary. Routine work. Boring, even. The kind of task you do with headphones in, thinking about what you're going to make for dinner. On March 9th of this year, during the spring leveling pass, I found something that wasn't routine. Section E, row 14. The grave belonged to a woman named Maren Elstad. I knew the plot because it was one of the more recent interments. She'd been buried the previous October, about 5 months before. I remembered the burial because I'd prepared the site. That's part of the job too. When a funeral is scheduled, I mark the plot, and the excavation company comes in with a backhoe to dig. After the service, they backfill, and I do the finish work, tamping, grading, laying sod. Maren Elstad's grave, 5 months after burial, should have shown minimal settling. New graves in clay-heavy Connecticut soil typically don't begin significant settling for 18 to 24 months, especially if the casket is a modern sealed unit, which hers was. I'd watched it go into the ground, a brushed steel Batesville, mid-range, sealed gasket. But when I walked row 14 with my probe rod that morning, I found a depression over Elstad's plot that was nearly 4 inches deep. Not a crack, Not erosion, a smooth, even sinking across the entire 6 by 3 foot footprint of the grave, as if the ground had been gently pressed down by a giant thumb. 4 inches in 5 months. From a sealed steel casket that shouldn't have lost structural integrity for years. I marked it for fill and moved on. I had 200 more plots to check. By the time I came back with the wheelbarrow that afternoon, the depression was 5 inches. I measured it with a tape. I'd noted 4 inches that morning. I keep a log, just a notebook in my back pocket, nothing formal, and now it was 5. An inch of additional settling in 6 hours. That's not settling. That's movement. That's the ground actively going somewhere. I filled it anyway. Topsoil, tamped, leveled. Went home. March 10th. I came back to check. The fill had sunk. Not all of it, the edges of the plot were level, but the center had dropped again, pulling the new topsoil down into a shallow bowl. The depression was back, maybe 2 inches now with the fresh fill, but the shape was different. Yesterday it had been a uniform rectangle matching the grave's footprint. Now it was oval. Longer than the grave. As if whatever was pulling the soil down had expanded its reach beyond the casket's dimensions. I probed the soil with the rod. In normal ground, the probe meets consistent resistance, root mass, compacted clay, stones. Over a filled grave, there's a softer layer where the backfill hasn't fully consolidated, but beneath that, you hit the lid of the vault or casket and the rod stops. The rod didn't stop. I pushed it down through the topsoil, through the backfill, which should have been about 5.5 feet deep to the vault lid, and at approximately 4 feet, the resistance vanished. The rod dropped. Not slowly, not like it was passing through soft material. It dropped, like I'd pushed it through a membrane into open air. I pulled it out. The bottom 18 inches of the probe rod were warm. Not ambient temperature warm. Body warm. The kind of warm that a metal object picks up from being held in a closed hand for 10 minutes. Except the rod had been in the ground, 4 feet deep, in March in Connecticut, where the soil temperature at that depth should be somewhere around 45 degrees. I touched the warm section. It was faintly damp. Not with water. The moisture had a texture to it, slightly viscous, like sap. I rubbed my fingers together and the residue was dark, the color of wet coffee grounds, and it didn't wipe off easily. I had to scrub it off on my jeans. I should have called someone. The cemetery board, the funeral home, someone with authority to authorize a disinterment investigation. That's the protocol when a grave shows structural irregularity. You don't dig up a grave on your own. There are legal processes. Permits. Next of kin notification. But I didn't call anyone. Not because I was compelled by curiosity or drawn by some irresistible need to understand. I want to be honest about that, because this isn't that kind of story. I didn't call anyone because it was a Friday afternoon and the cemetery board doesn't meet until Tuesdays, and I told myself I'd report it then. I cleaned the probe rod, put my tools away, and went home. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of anxiety or fear. Because of my hands. The residue from the probe rod, the dark, viscous substance I'd wiped on my jeans, had left a stain on my right thumb and index finger. I noticed it in the shower. A faint discoloration under the skin, like a bruise, except it followed the exact lines where the residue had been. I scrubbed it. It didn't change. I told myself it was a tannin stain from the soil. Oak root tannins can stain skin, it happens, and I went to bed. At 2:40 a.m., I woke up because my right hand was hot. Not painful. Not inflamed. Just warm, the way the probe rod had been warm. A deep, even heat that seemed to come from inside the tissue, from the muscle and bone, not the skin. I held my hand up in the dark and I could feel it radiating, the way a stovetop element radiates after you turn it off. Residual. Stored. I ran cold water over it for 3 minutes. The heat faded. I went back to sleep. In the morning, the stain was darker. March 11th, Saturday. I don't usually work weekends, but I drove to the cemetery anyway. Told myself I was just checking. Just looking. The depression over Elstad's grave was back. Deeper. 6 inches now, even with the fill I'd added 2 days ago. And the oval shape had expanded further. The sinking wasn't limited to the grave anymore, it extended about 2 feet beyond the footprint on all sides, encroaching on the adjacent plots. The grass at the edges of the expanding depression was darker than the surrounding turf. Not dead. Darker green. The kind of aggressive, almost black-green growth you see in soil that's been heavily fertilized. I knelt at the edge of the depression and put my hand on the dark grass. Warm. The ground was warm. Not the air, it was 41 degrees that morning, overcast, typical March in New England. The soil itself, within the radius of the depression, was warm to the touch. I pushed my fingers into the turf, through the root layer, into the soil beneath, and the deeper I pushed, the warmer it got. I pulled my hand out. My fingers were stained again. The same dark residue, thicker this time, coating my fingertips like I dipped them in ink. I stood up and looked at the adjacent graves. To the left of Elstad's plot was a grave from 2018, a man named Arthur Perrine, 71, died of a stroke. To the right was a 2020 burial, Helen Cass, 68, cancer. Behind was a 1997 plot, name I don't remember. In front, across the path, was an empty reserved plot. The sinking was touching Perrine's grave on the left side. The grass over Perrine's plot, at the corner closest to Elstad, was showing the same dark green growth. And when I probed Perrine's grave at that corner, the soil was looser than it should have been for a 6-year-old burial. Something from Elstad's grave was spreading into the neighboring plots. Through the soil. Expanding laterally like a root system or a slow underground flood, except it wasn't water and it wasn't roots. It was heat and dark residue and a loosening of compacted earth, as if the ground were being digested. I need to talk about Maren Elstad. I didn't know her. She wasn't a Harlow local, the funeral home that handled her service was from Mystic, about 30 miles east, and the next of kin listed on the burial authorization was a brother in Eugene, Oregon. No local family. No one who visited the grave. In 5 months, I hadn't seen a single flower, flag, or token left at her headstone, which was a flat granite marker, nothing elaborate. I went home and looked her up. Not out of compulsion. Out of the practical recognition that something was wrong with her grave and that knowing who she was might help me understand what was happening. Maren Elstad. Born 1971. Died October 3, 2025, at age 54. That was all the obituary said. No cause of death. No survivors listed except the brother. No memorial service, the burial had been a direct interment, which means the casket goes in the ground without a ceremony. I'd been there. It had been me, the backhoe operator, and a funeral director from the Mystic home who'd overseen the lowering and signed the paperwork. No mourners. No one. I searched deeper. Social media. Public records. Maren Elstad had almost no presence. A LinkedIn profile listing her as a soil scientist that caught my attention, affiliated with the University of Connecticut's Department of Natural Resources and the Environment. The profile hadn't been updated since 2022. No publications listed. No photo. A soil scientist. I searched for her name combined with Yukon, combined with research, combined with anything that might tell me what she'd been working on. One result. A cached page from a Yukon departmental newsletter, dated spring 2021. A brief item about a grant awarded to Dr. Maren Elstad for research into, and I'm quoting from memory here because the page is gone now, I checked yesterday and it's been removed, mycelial network communication and directed nutrient transfer in closed system soil environments. Mycelial networks. Fungal networks. The underground web of fungal threads that connects the root systems of trees and plants, allowing them to share nutrients and chemical signals. It's real science. Mainstream ecology. The Wood Wide Web, some researchers call it. Trees use it to send sugar to their offspring, to warn neighboring trees about insect attacks, to redistribute resources from healthy areas to stressed ones. Maren Elstad had been studying how to direct those transfers. How to make the network send things where you wanted them to go. In closed systems. Like a casket. Like a sealed steel box buried in biologically active Connecticut soil, surrounded by root systems and fungal networks that connect every grave in the cemetery to every other grave in an unbroken underground web. I sat at my kitchen table and I looked at the stain on my fingers and I thought about what a soil scientist might do if she knew she was dying and had spent her career studying how to make the ground move things from one place to another. March 12th, Sunday. I went back to the cemetery before dawn. 5:20 a.m. The sky was just beginning to lighten. I brought a shovel, not the probe rod. I brought a flashlight. I brought work gloves, which I should have been wearing all along. The depression had deepened overnight. 8 inches. The oval had expanded another foot in every direction. The dark grass now covered portions of 3 adjacent graves, Perrine, Cass, and the 1997 plot behind. When I walked across the affected area, the ground felt soft underfoot, almost spongy, like walking on a mattress. And it was warm through the soles of my boots. I started digging. I want to be precise about this. I didn't have legal authorization to excavate a grave. What I did was illegal. I knew that while I was doing it. I made the choice anyway, because the alternative was to wait until Tuesday, present my findings to a cemetery board composed of 3 retired accountants and a town selectman, try to explain that a grave was warm and spreading, and hope they'd expedite a disinterment permit that normally takes 2 to 4 weeks. In 2 to 4 weeks, based on the rate of expansion I was observing, the affected zone would have reached a dozen more graves. Maybe more. I dug. Connecticut clay is heavy, dense work with a shovel. But the soil over Elstad's grave wasn't clay anymore. Not in the upper layers. The first 2 feet came out like garden loam, dark, loose, rich, teeming with earthworms. More earthworms than I've ever seen in one place. Not dozens. Hundreds. The soil was alive in a way that soil in a 5-month-old grave should not be. It was warm to the touch, even through my gloves, and it had a smell, not decay, not rot, not the sulfur stink of anaerobic decomposition. It smelled like growth. Like the inside of a greenhouse in July. Wet earth, green things, biological activity at a rate that made the air above the hole humid. At 3 feet, I started finding the threads. White at first, then pale yellow, then deeper, a color I can only describe as amber. Fungal hyphae. Mycelium. Threads of it running horizontally through the soil in every direction, dense enough that pulling out a shovelful was like pulling apart a mat of wet hair. The threads clung to the shovel, to my gloves, to each other. They were warm. Warmer than the soil. When I accidentally broke a thick cord of them, the broken ends didn't go limp. They moved. Slowly, visibly, the broken filaments reached toward each other, like fingers trying to reconnect. At 4 feet, I hit the void. The same void the probe rod had dropped into. The soil ended and there was open space, a gap, maybe 10 inches high, between the bottom of my excavation and the top of the concrete vault that should have been directly below. In a normal grave, the backfill sits directly on the vault lid with no gap. The soil compresses against it, sealed. Here, the soil had been pulled away from the vault, held up by the mycelial mat like a false ceiling, creating a cavity. Inside the cavity, it was hot. Not warm. Hot. I held my hand in the gap and the air was easily 90 degrees, maybe more. And the smell changed. The greenhouse smell was still there, but now there was something underneath it. Something organic and intimate. The smell of breath. Not metaphorical. I smelled exhalation. The warm, slightly sour, unmistakably human smell of someone breathing in a closed space. I pulled back. I knelt at the edge of the hole, 4 feet deep, at 5:47 in the morning, and I held still. And I heard it. Not from the ground. From my hands. A sound, or not a sound, exactly, but a vibration, conducted through the stain on my fingers, through my skin, into the small bones of my hand. A pulse. Rhythmic. Slow. Like a heartbeat, but too slow for a living person. Maybe 30 beats per minute. Maybe less. The stain on my fingers was connected to whatever was in the ground. The residue, the mycelial secretion, the dark substance that had soaked into my skin, was a thread. A connection. Part of the network. I was part of the network. I kept digging. I have to be honest, this was the moment where I could have stopped, and I chose not to. Not because I was in a trance. Not because I was being pulled by some supernatural compulsion. I chose to keep digging because a woman was buried in this ground 5 months ago and the soil smelled like breathing and I needed to know if she was alive. That's not curiosity. That's a moral obligation. If someone is alive in a box in the ground, you dig. I cleared the vault lid. Concrete, standard cemetery vault, 2-piece construction, a base that the casket sits in and a lid that seals over the top. The lid was intact but the seal had been compromised. Along the seam where lid met base, the mycelium had grown into the joint, forcing it apart by millimeters, enough to breach the vault's air seal. The fungal threads ran into the vault through this breach in dense braids, like cables feeding into a junction box. I couldn't lift the vault lid alone. It weighs over 300 pounds. But the mycelium had done so much structural work on the seal that when I wedged the shovel blade into the gap and levered, the lid shifted. 1 inch. 2. Enough to see inside. The casket was open. Not damaged. Not broken. The lid of the Batesville steel casket was unlatched and raised about 6 inches, held open by, I need to describe this carefully, a dense, structured growth of mycelium that had built itself into a scaffold inside the vault. The fungal network hadn't just penetrated the vault. It had colonized it. Every interior surface was covered in a thick mat of amber-colored growth, and the mat had formed shapes. Not random growth patterns. Architectural shapes. Buttresses, arches, channels. It had built a structure inside the vault the way coral builds a reef, organized, purposeful, engineered. And inside the casket, visible through the 6-inch gap of the raised lid, was Maren Elstad. She was not decomposed. 5 months in the ground. In a breached vault, with air exchange, with biological activity, in conditions that should have accelerated decomposition beyond recognition. And she was intact. Skin, hair, features, all present, all identifiable. She looked like she was sleeping. The mycelium covered her body in a fine layer, like a blanket of cobweb, and it moved with a rhythm that I recognized. The same rhythm as the pulse in my hands. I want to describe her face. This is important because of what it means. Maren Elstad's face, in the casket, was not the face of a dead woman preserved by unusual conditions. It was not waxy, not bloated, not sunken. It was the face of a woman in concentration. Her brow was slightly furrowed. Her lips were pressed together. Her eyes were closed but the muscles around them were engaged, the way your eye muscles look when you're dreaming, or when you're thinking hard about something with your eyes shut. She looked like someone doing difficult work. I stared at her for what might have been a minute or might have been 10. The heat rising from the vault was immense, tropical, and it carried her smell, not death, not decay, but the human smell of a living body in an enclosed space. Sweat and skin and the faint metabolic output of a functioning organism. At some point during those minutes, the pulse in my hands changed. It quickened. From the slow 30-beat rhythm to something faster, maybe 50, maybe 60. And it wasn't just a pulse anymore. It was textured. Complex. Like a message being tapped in code, except the code was being transmitted through fungal chemistry directly into my nervous system. And then Maren Elstad opened her eyes. Not slowly. Not with the sluggish flutter of someone waking up. Her eyes opened the way you open your eyes when you've been waiting for someone to arrive and you finally hear them at the door. Alert. Focused. Ready. She looked at me. Brown eyes. Clear. Conscious. Present. She looked at me, and the mycelial network that connected her body to my hands through the soil pulsed once, hard, and I felt it in my chest like a second heartbeat. And she spoke. Her voice was dry, cracked, the voice of someone who hasn't used vocal cords in months, but the words were unmistakable. You took longer than I expected. I fell backward. Out of the hole, onto the grass, landing hard on my back. The sky above me was pale gray, the first real light of morning, and I lay there and breathed and felt the pulse in my hands accelerating, synchronizing with something that was not my own cardiovascular system. She expected me. Not anyone. Me. The person who tends the ground. The person whose hands are in the soil every day, who touches every grave, who would be the first to notice the changes and the first to make physical contact with the residue. I got up. I looked back into the hole. She was still looking up through the gap in the vault lid, her eyes tracking me with a patience that was worse than hunger. What are you? I said. Alive, she said. That's the point. You've been down there for 5 months. Yes. How? She blinked, and when she opened her eyes again, the irises were different. Not brown now. Amber. The same color as the mycelium. The network sustains me. Water, nutrients, oxygen, all of it moves through soil. I just taught it to move it to me. Through me. I'm not lying in the ground, Paul. I'm planted in it. She knew my name. I read you through the network. You've been in this soil for 3 years. Your skin cells, your sweat, your blood from every cut and scratch, it's all in the ground, and the ground is connected to me. I know you the way a tree knows the rain. The pulse in my hands was so strong now that I could see my fingers trembling. What do you want? To grow. She said it simply. Not with menace. Not with theatricality. The way a plant would say it, if a plant could speak. A statement of biological purpose. The network can sustain one body indefinitely. That's what my research proved. A closed-system fungal network, properly directed, can provide everything a human body needs. Indefinitely. No food. No water from external sources. No medical intervention. The soil provides. But one body is a proof of concept. I need to know if it scales. Scales. The adjacent graves. The network is reaching them. Testing whether it can integrate biological material that's further along in decomposition. Arthur Perrine has been in the ground for 6 years. His body is mostly skeletal, but the mycelium is threading through the remaining connective tissue, rebuilding the nutrient pathways, restoring the substrate. You're trying to bring them back. I'm trying to grow them back. There's a difference. A resurrection implies restoring what was. I'm building something new from what remains. The network doesn't need an intact brain or a beating heart. It needs a scaffold. Bone. Connective tissue. A shape. It provides everything else. I stared at her amber eyes and I understood 2 things simultaneously. The first was that she was telling the truth. The science was real, or at least it was built on real science pushed to a place no peer review board would ever sanction. Mycelial networks do transport nutrients. They do communicate chemically. They do integrate with biological tissue. Everything she'd done was an extension, a grotesque, visionary, impossible extension, of principles that exist in any ecology textbook. The second thing I understood was that the stain on my hands was not a byproduct. It was not contamination. It was inoculation. The residue on my skin, I said. Yes. You put it there. When I probed the grave. When I touched the soil. The network extended to you because you were available. I didn't plan the specific moment. But I prepared the soil above my grave to be the interface. Anyone who touched it deeply enough would receive the connection. What does it do? Right now. It lets me communicate with you. The pulse you feel is a low-bandwidth chemical signal. It'll become more complex over time as the hyphae integrate further with your dermal tissue. What happens when it fully integrates? She didn't answer immediately. The mycelium around her body shifted, the cobweb layer rippling like something breathing underneath it. You become part of the network. And then the network grows through you the way it's growing through the others. You're alive, though. That's the interesting variable. Perrine and Cass and the others are dead material being rebuilt. You'd be the first living integration. The network has never had a conscious node above ground. I stood at the edge of the hole and I looked at my hands. The stain had spread. Not visibly, not in the last few minutes, but I could feel it. The warmth was no longer limited to my fingers. It was in my palms. In my wrists. A slow, comfortable heat, like holding a warm mug, moving inward through tissue that was learning to conduct something it had never been asked to conduct before. I made a decision. I picked up the shovel. Marin's eyes followed the motion. Her expression didn't change, the same focused concentration, the same patience, but the mycelium around her body contracted slightly. A flinch. The network had felt my intent before my muscles executed it. If I seal this vault, I said, and fill this grave with concrete instead of soil. If I cut off the network from air and water at this node, what happens to you? I die. Truly, this time. And the network persists. It's already too distributed. Killing me kills the directing intelligence, but the infrastructure remains. The hyphae in the adjacent graves, the connections to the root systems, the threads in your skin, all of it stays. It just stops being guided. An unguided network in a cemetery full of human remains. Yes. It would still transport. Still integrate. Still grow. But without purpose. Without direction. Essentially, you'd have a fungal system that moves biological material around randomly, connecting the dead to the soil to the trees to anyone who touches the ground. A network that doesn't know what it's doing but does it anyway. I understood the choice. Leave her alive, and she directs the network. She grows it deliberately. She decides what it connects and how fast and toward what purpose. The expansion is controlled, intentional, the work of a conscious mind. The adjacent graves become her project. I become her project. The cemetery becomes an organism with her at its center. Kill her, and the network runs wild. No intelligence. No direction. Just a vast, distributed fungal system that does what fungal systems do: decompose, transport, integrate, except it's been supercharged and modified, and it's threaded through 2,000 graves and the root systems of every tree in Cedar Bluff and the skin of my hands and wrists and God knows where else by now. One option is a controlled horror. The other is an uncontrolled one. And standing between them, holding a shovel, was me. I filled in the grave. Not with concrete. I didn't kill her. I put the soil back, shovelful by shovelful, and I tamped it down and I leveled it and I laid the sod patches back over the top. I erased every sign that anyone had dug there. I cleaned my shovel, returned it to the maintenance shed, and drove home. At the kitchen table, I washed my hands 11 times. The stain didn't come off. It's darker now than it was this morning. It's up to my wrists. And the pulse, her pulse, the network's pulse, is constant. I feel it the way you feel your own heartbeat when you lie in bed at night and the house is quiet. It's there. It's part of me. Tomorrow is Monday. I'll go to work. I'll mow the grass and edge the pathways and check the headstones for stability. I'll walk the grounds of Cedar Bluff Memorial Gardens the way I've walked them for 3 years, except now every step I take is on top of a network that knows I'm there and is threading itself further into the bones of 2,200 dead. She told me the expansion rate is accelerating. The dark grass has reached 6 more graves since yesterday. She tells me this through the pulse, the low-bandwidth chemical signal that's becoming less low-bandwidth by the hour. It's not words. It's not language. It's more like knowing. I know things about the soil now the way I know things about my own body. I know where the network is strong and where it's thin. I know which graves have viable substrate and which are too old, too degraded, too far from the main body. I know that Arthur Perine's skeleton is now fully threaded with mycelium, and that something in the configuration of his remains has begun to generate heat. I know that the network has reached the tree line at the southern boundary and is entering the state forest through the root systems of white oaks. I know that yesterday, a jogger stopped at the edge of the cemetery to tie her shoe and put her bare hand on the grass for balance, and that a thread, thinner than a hair, reached the surface and touched her palm, and that she felt nothing and stood up and jogged away carrying a seed of the network into whatever soil she next touches. Marin told me, through the pulse, through the knowing, that this is what she wanted. Not the cemetery. The cemetery was the nursery. The real project is the world above it. I could still stop it. I could go back tonight with bags of concrete and a jackhammer and I could kill her. The network would go undirected, but maybe undirected is better than this. Maybe random fungal chaos in a Connecticut cemetery is a smaller horror than a conscious, expanding, deliberately guided organism that's learning how to integrate living humans through skin contact. But I'd still be part of it. The stain is in me. She told me that killing her wouldn't remove the connection, it would just make me the network's most complex node. An unguided network with a living human threaded into it. She didn't say what that would feel like. She didn't have to. I can imagine it well enough, the constant pulse with no one on the other end, the knowing without a knower, the sensation of being connected to 2,000 dead and 1,000,000 miles of fungal thread and having no one directing the current. She gave me a choice that isn't a choice. Keep her alive, and the network has a mind. A purpose. A direction. A woman in the ground who decides what grows and how fast and where it reaches next. Kill her, and the network has me. It's 6:47 p.m. The stain is past my wrists now. I can feel it in my forearms, a warmth that's becoming familiar, almost comforting. The pulse syncs with my breathing when I stop thinking about it. When I let it. Outside, the sun is going down. In about 12 hours, I'll be back at Cedar Bluff, walking the grounds, my hands in the soil, tending a cemetery that is no longer a place where the dead stay dead. I chose this. That's what I need you to understand. Not because I was tricked or compelled or seduced by the need to understand. I stood at the edge of that grave with a shovel in my hand and two clear options in front of me, and I chose the one that let someone else be in charge of the thing I can't control. I chose to let her grow. And right now, through the pulse, I can feel her down there. 4 feet under the sod of Section E, row 14. Awake. Working. Patient. Connected to me through the thread in my skin and the soil under my feet and the vast, quiet, hungry network that is learning, tonight, how to reach the roots of the white oaks at the forest edge, and from there into the woods, and from there into the fields, and from there into every garden and yard and park in Harlow, Connecticut. She's not evil. I want to say that. She's not malicious or cruel or monstrous. She's a scientist who found a way to not die and decided to see how far it could go. The horror isn't in what she is. The horror is in what I chose. Because every morning when I wake up now, the stain is a little further up my arms. And every morning, the knowing is a little louder. And I am starting to understand things about the soil, about what's in it, about what it can do, about what it wants, that no groundskeeper should understand. And I am starting to wonder if the choice I made at the edge of that grave was really mine at all, or if the network had already reached my brain through the thread in my hands, and the decision to let her live was the first thing she grew inside me. I wash my hands. It doesn't come off.